Biogen has an Alzheimer's drug that on Monday the FDA approved. It's the first new treatment for Alzheimer's in almost 2 decades. And Biogen's drug is not a cure for Alzheimer's, and Freeberg will get into that. It does not reverse the disease's progression, but it does mitigate it against it getting worse. Very strange moment in time. The FDA's advisory panel, 3 members of it, have quit because they didn't want to approve this drug because it had such a modest efficacy.
3 quit, but unanimous vote against approval.
Right. So unanimous vote against, then 3 quit. And this is, I think, out of 10 or 11 individuals. So this is truly significant. The drug is going to cost $55,000. It still requires brain scans and all this kind of stuff, but it's hope for people suffering. And so the FDA approved it. What we're seeing here is what's happening in journalism and social media now happening in science, or is this some other search for truth or some other issue?
The Biogen drug that was approved this week is called aducanumab. Remember, any drug that ends with MAB, M-A-B, means monoclonal antibody. So it's an antibody, and antibodies, as we've talked about in the past, are proteins that can be made by our immune system and proteins that bind to a specific target that then tells your immune system to clear that target out of your body. So that's what monoclonal antibodies do. And we have been using biological drugs, monoclonal antibody drugs, for decades now to target specific cells or specific proteins in our body that we can then remove from our body, and that can reverse or change, human health in very significant ways. So this is a class of drugs that is very efficacious for having specific outcomes across many disease states. And so years ago, researchers at the University of Zurich were looking at people with Alzheimer's that were having slowly progressive dementia, and they looked at antibodies that they could find in their brain. And they found this antibody that they saw was binding to amyloid plaque. And amyloid plaque is one of the theorized mechanisms by which Alzheimer's progresses. That as amyloid plaque builds up in your brain, you start to have dysfunction and inflammation, and the amyloid plaque kind of may be the driver of Alzheimer's, but that is not proven. So they then, ultimately gave it to a company called Neurimmune, who licensed it to Biogen, and Biogen started testing it. And they took this antibody that they discovered, and they turned it into an antibody you can now get injected into your body, goes into your brain. The idea is it binds to amyloid plaque and removes it from your brain. And so theoretically, this should slow down or stop Alzheimer's. But it turns out that as they ran this test across thousands of patients, it didn't have as much of an effect. And in fact, the data across many, many patients showed that it didn't really, off of a placebo baseline, meaning people that didn't get the drug versus people that did get the drug, that it wasn't really that different in terms of cognitive scores and tests and all this other stuff. So they abandoned it a few years ago. They kind of got this, they stopped the trial. They had this kind of negative outcome, and Biogen got beat up for it. And then all of a sudden they refiled about 9 months later with the FDA saying, well, look, when we look at the patients with the highest dosage of the drug, because they gave it in 3 different doses, so the people that got the most antibodies, this particular group of people had a 23% decline in the progression of their Alzheimer's, which is kind of one way of slicing the data. And as a result, they went back to the FDA, and people were like, well, some of the tests don't really show that still. There was some cognitive test results that didn't show that was the case, and they fought back against, and so some people were pushing back against it. And we're not sure, no one knows for sure how it all kind of came together at the end, but the FDA ultimately approved this drug. And here's what's challenging about this. You basically will go in, you'll get an injection of this antibody, just like you do with many other antibody-based therapies. It costs roughly $5 to make antibody therapies, just to be clear. So when you make them, $5 roughly is the cost, and they're charging $56,000 for this treatment. So that's problem one in the pharmaceutical kind of debate: is should we be charging the quality of life premium? And then
Medicare
number
Part
two,
B.
Yeah, and then the kind of second issue is like, should this thing have been approved when it wasn't really that efficacious, and you could slice the data slightly? And now all payers, meaning all people who are insured, or the government, or whoever it is that's responsible for insurance payments, is ultimately bearing the cost of everyone with Alzheimer's. And there's 15 million people in the United States with Alzheimer's. They're going to raise their hand and say, oh my God, anything that gives me any chance or any hope, I want to get. But if it costs $56,000, is it really the responsibility of the insurance company and all the payers to give everyone a hope, even if the drug may not work? Now, the downside and the side effects is negligible. There's no risk to taking this drug. So it's all about the cost and the upside. And that is the big philosophical debate right now. Is like, first of all, should we approve drugs like this? Should we allow pharma companies to charge whatever they want, even when the efficacy is very low and the cost is very low to make this stuff? And how do we ultimately decide what we approve and what we pay for?
So this is a classic risk reward. Chamath, how do you look at this on a financial basis?
Yeah, let me give you sort of like a market investing kind of view on this. Look, I've been taking biotech pretty seriously over the last 18 months, just trying to learn, because I think basically Freeberg incepted me with this idea that you have to know it. So here's what's interesting in the setup for what I've learned and putting a little bit of my knowledge together, which is dangerous. But the setup for Alzheimer's is really scary. If you're Black, you're 20% more likely to get it. If you look at the distribution of all patients, 60% and upwards of 64, 65% are women. So if you think about the distribution of this disease, it's the disease of minorities and it's the disease of women. Now, that's problematic in and of itself, because if you want to have any form of equality, it seems like this is something that we have to tackle. The second interesting thing as a setup to this is every single Alzheimer's drug that's ever gone through the FDA has been rejected and has failed. And what's interesting, and the more social science around this, is this was also where two of the more infamous insider trading events ever happened, was around failed Alzheimer's drug. The first, which is less known but inside baseball, is what happened at SAC, which was a huge hedge fund. But the second that's very well known is Martha Stewart, and why she went to jail was around the speculation and the insider trading of the phase 3 results of an Alzheimer's drug, which ultimately turned out to fail. It was almost the surest money on Wall Street, which is every time one of these drugs came to market, you just bet against it and it would turn out that these stocks would collapse. So there's the social and market setup. I am super torn, but I think there are some positive points to make on this thing. But let me give you the negative case. The negative case is, what is the FDA doing approving a drug where there's no clear evidence that it leads to clinical benefits and it could give families a sense of false hope? What are you doing in terms of process if you have a unanimous vote against approval? So why do you even bother having an FDA advisory committee of outside experts if they're just going to do what you want? And it could set a precedent where companies can get drugs approved on limited evidence. Now, here's the positive point, which is they may be taking a long-term view, and what they could be really doing is creating a market that ultimately incentivizes other folks to come in, where then ultimately those people are the ones that find the solution, right? Because this Biogen drug, Biogen came out and basically said, we think this is a $100 billion market. So now all of a sudden you must believe capitalism is going to take hold, and a lot of young startups will say, well, shit, I should be going after this market as well. And so by going after that, after Biogen, then maybe you actually do get to the solution.